think I should be able to do this one. So, let me make sure about that. Yep. Okay. All right. I'm going to stand right here. I am super excited to be here. This is my first ever hack night. This is intimidating. You all sound very smart. So I'm going to talk about building permit data in a different way. During the summer of 2012, I used the city's building permit data to analyze patterns of construction and demolition, or I should say demolition and new construction in Chicago between the period of 2004 and 2012. So I'm going to talk about who I am, the data I used, some of the spatial patterns that I found, some examples of the analysis. I'm certainly not going to go into all of the analysis that I did, and some of the challenges and lessons that I learned and what the result of the project was. So I'm getting used to, I just got married, I'm getting used to my new last name. It's actually Tina Fassett Smith. And if you have any questions about this or anything else that you don't get to today, you can contact me via email or via Twitter. Right now, I'm the Policy and Communications Associate at the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul University. But when I did this, I was but a lowly intern at the Preservation Green Lab, which is a project of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So Preservation Green Lab is a small project of the Trust that actually is run in Seattle, whose aim is to do research and market that research that shows historic preservation is a key part of sustainable urban policy. I was working out of the Chicago office. And the goal, I was hired to look at drivers of demolition in Chicago with the goal of getting just enough done to show this to the Urban Land Institute in hopes that they would fund a larger study in a major U.S. city. And of course, my hope as a lowly intern was that if that happened, I would get a job and would get to work on that major study. So the data I was using, we wanted to look at data from 2000 to 2012, which is when May of 2012 was when I started the project. So as you may know, on the city's data portal, you can go back to January 2006. And if you did that between January 2006 and May 2012, you would find 263,503 permits. There's lots more than these, but these were kind of the major ones, some of the major categories that were on the city's data portal. So I did a FOIA request for one previous to 2006, and I was informed by the very nice person who helped me that it only in a reasonable amount of time, they would only be able to get me back to 2004. When I got that, the result of that FOIA request, there was only 3,176 permits because I only got new construction and demolition, but that's all I needed, so that was fine. So I had a pool of 270,000 permits, and I quickly realized upon looking at them that I was going to have to narrow them down a lot because I was interested in demolitions of real buildings. And there are building permits for demolitions of canopies, for festivals, tents if they're big enough, porches, parts of buildings, big signs that aren't part of the sign permit. And it was at that moment that I realized I was going to have to go through these permits kind of one by one. I don't know anything about coding or working. This was my first project working with data, so I literally went through them one by one. Not all 270,000. I obviously I know how to search and delete things that don't fall into like a major search category. So I ended up with 8,714 demolitions of real buildings that I was working with, our demolition permits. So there were 13,334 new construction permits of actual buildings that I could tell. But what the trust was interested in were what's referred to as teardowns, or buildings that are torn down that are probably still habitable, that are being torn down for rapid redevelopment. So I looked at new construction permits where a demolition permit had been issued during the period I was looking at, 2004 to 2012. That's not a great methodology for looking at teardowns because that's a really long time span, but I had 3 months and that was the best I could come up with at the moment. So that narrowed it down to 2,857 new construction permits that I was looking at. So the questions we wanted to know was, is there a pattern to demolitions? What areas of the city are most vulnerable to demolition activity? What types of buildings are being demolished? How rapidly are they being replaced? And what are they being replaced with? So the first thing I did was take the demolition permits, the 8,714, and geocode them. And to my lucky surprise, they geocoded at a very high rate, like 99%. And the patterns were pretty clear. While there's concentration through the city, there's one area that's really, really dense, and that's around the river on the north side, Lakeview, Lincoln Park, Logan Square, West Town. So the next thing we wanted to do was look at that compared to like significant boundaries. Since I'm working with a trust, one of the first ones we looked at was historic landmarks. So these are the city's landmark districts. And the reason I specifically wanted to show you this slide is because I go through 3 months of work and I do all this mapping, and I was really lucky that I got to present it in front of lots of really interesting stakeholders, people from the city, people from National Housing Services, and people who work on the ground in these neighborhoods. And maybe of all of those people, my biggest hero is a guy named Terry Tatum, who's the chief researcher in the Historic Preservation Division, who works with the city's Landmark Commission. And the first thing, I didn't even get through this slide before Terry Tatum said, "This is wrong." I actually give out permits in landmark districts for demolitions, and I definitely have not given out 72 since 2004. And so that gave me cause to pause in my presentation and freak out. But what I'd made a really simple mistake. I had not accounted for when a landmark area had become districted, or a district had become landmarked. So what had happened was these demolition permits were issued before the area was landmarked. And what that would have been really interesting to take more time and look at, because there could be a relationship between a spike in demolition activity as an area is going through the process of being landmarked. But the second thing he said was much more disturbing, which was, how do you know that there's been 1,503 demolitions within a quarter mile of a historic district? And I said, because I used a buffer and GIS, and he was like, no. What you've shown is that 1,503 demolition permits have been issued to addresses within a quarter mile of a historic district, because if you know anything about permits, you know that a permit doesn't tell you anything about subsequent activity on land. You have to go physically look at it to see if something happened. Just because something is given a permit to be demolished does not mean that that building is demolished, nor does everyone who demolishes a building in Chicago go through the permitting process. A lot of developers will demolish something and then deal with the consequences of that, whether it be fines or whatever else later. So that was also disturbing to hear. So if I was to update this to give to a group interested in historic preservation, not that you guys aren't, but I didn't update these slides, I wanted to show you what I actually did, I would change this language to be much more clear about this is not demolitions that have occurred, this is permits that have been issued. So I looked at permit activity with lots of different boundaries. This shows TIF districts in salmon and open space in green, landmarks in yellow, to come up with lots of different statistics about where demolitions are happening. But the geography we were really interested in were wards, and that's because of the unique relationship that city aldermen, or the power that city aldermen have over the permitting process.
It's very unique.
It is unique, like so many things about Chicago. If this analysis had ever gotten to like a public policy recommendation stage, which it didn't while I was involved in it, we wanted to be able to, we had those numbers for wards at the ready so that we could talk to individual aldermen about activity in their wards. So using Madison Street as a divider from the city, so on the north side and the south side, I just did a count of where wards had the most demolition permits issued in them, north versus south. And so you see 32, 147. I know that unless you know the city's wards, these really don't have a spatial relationship in your mind, but that's Logan Square, Lincoln Park, Lakeview, West Town, and the wards on the south side. I guess my point is that 31, 1, and 47 all abut each other. 3, 34, and 2 are nowhere near each other. These numbers are really different. The raw numbers are just really different from the north to the south. So that's what stood out when we did that. If you look at it on a map, so this just shows concentration, lightest colors have the least amount of demolition permit activity, darkest colors have the most. You know, there's a variation and there's one real area of concentration. When you see the new construction matching map, you'll really see a big difference between these two, but that's what it looks like across the city, divided by wards. So the trick was how to show this at a parcel level in a meaningful way. So what this is Ward 32, the ward with the highest number of demolitions. The ward is outlined in orange. We've got, I think this is salmon. You've got a TIF district in kind of like a pink color. You've got historic districts in yellow, and then you've got your demolition activity in white, or permit activity. And it's, you know, pretty basic residential pattern. You see that not as much in landmark districts as in other, or around them as in other areas of the ward. And this is what it looks like in Ward 3, which is the ward with the highest number of demolition permits on the south side. Much more dispersed. This is like Grand Boulevard, near Hyde Park. So just a really different pattern, as you would expect after looking at the concentration levels. But where it got really interesting was looking at that teardown rate. So again, what we did was take new construction permits and match them to addresses that had been issued a demolition permit within the study period, 2004 to 2012. And the interesting thing is that the wards at the top 3 demolition permit activity are the same ones that have the top 3 teardown activity, Ward 32, 1, and 47. 3 completely different wards have the top teardown activity on the south side of the city. And again, your numbers are really different as far as just raw numbers. And when you look at this map, to me, this kind of was the most startling. You have no variation in this almost. It's completely concentrated on the north side, with very, very little activity on the south side. So this is what it looks like with the dot density on top of it of that. Again, this is not all new construction during this period. That's really important to remember. This is new construction where demolition had occurred in the same time period. You know, I used building replacement rate, 51% on the north side, 11% on the south side. I would not say that if I was giving this presentation again and I could update these slides. I would say, you know, the rate at which, you've heard me say a lot, permits were issued to demolition addresses that had been given a demolition permit. So this is what that teardown activity looks like in Ward 32. Really dense, just as you would expect. And in Ward 11, which is Bridgeport McKinley Park, much more spread out, much less dense. So we were really interested in what type of buildings were being demolished and what they were being replaced with. And this is where rentals come into play. This is really, really difficult to figure out because you have to go through the work description of a building permit to find this information. It may or may not be there. And it's really different for demolition activity versus construction activity. You see a really high number of unknowns, and that's because it may be that a building is blighted and old, and the people who are tearing it down don't know what it was, or how many units it had, or how many stories it was, maybe even. Certainly may not know whether it was mixed use or multifamily. And the people who are entering the permit don't have that information in front of them, and how are they supposed to find out? But when you have blueprints and building plans in front of you, that information is really easy to determine. It's just a matter of whether they put it in the work description or not. So where there are unknowns, it probably was blank or misspelled to the point where I couldn't decipher it. But these numbers were all me taking 5 weeks, listening to a lot of podcasts, and typing out building type 1 permit at a time.
Have you pulled the zoning data as well?
You know, that wasn't available when I was doing this.
Is the project also interested going in the gut and refurbish?
We did not look at that at all. You know, I mean, from a historic preservation perspective, that would be an obvious next step to look at rehabs and what's driving that versus demolition. But I had basically had 2 months to get something to put in front of Urban Land Institute, so that we weren't able to go into that. Of course, from a preservation perspective, we were interested in what year buildings were how old they were when they were being torn down. This came from the building outline shapefile, which is also available on the city's portal, and super high number of unknowns from that data set as well. But the buildings that we found were being most sensitive to demolition were built in the 1890s, which is a bummer.
Does this look any different than the profile of all the buildings?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I would.
In the City of Big Data exhibit, there's a histogram similar to this that.
Do you remember what that is?
Can you try it from memory? Here is from the research that we've done at IHS. I can tell you this: Chicago's old. Its building stock is very old. It would not surprise me if this is very similar to. I wouldn't be surprised too if that unknown is similar to the unknown of the city as well.
Where'd you say you got the building age?
Building outline shapefile.
Yeah, where was that?
Oh, it's on your data portal. It's a shapefile that outlines every building in the city.
I've heard of that.
It's I want to not every building. I want to say it's
Lots
of them, and it's a very, I don't know if anyone here, I'm sure one of you must be an expert on this data set, but it's questionable on its own, but it was the best that I could come up with at the time. So, challenges, hand-entered work descriptions with lots of important fields missing. I too would have some recommendations for how permits could be improved for this type of work. Building type, stories, materials. Permits, it's really, really important to remember when you're working with this data that it is a record of permits that are issued. It is not a record of actual buildings that are being demolished or constructed, especially when you're thinking about demolitions.
Is there no record of the permits being closed? Like, I know I recently did some electrical work and they had to come and inspect the work that the electric permit was issued for, and they closed out the permit when it passed inspection.
Not
a matter of record?
I do not know. I can tell you that when you put this in Excel, the permit goes on forever because there's all the contractor activity that's in there, and first thing I did was get rid of all of that.
There is a status on that portal that you can use to utilize to find out whether the permit is still open, whether it is void, or it is closed, and you can use that for the activity.
So would that tell you, from a demolition perspective, whether the building had been demolished or not, or?
It would.
It would, and how is that verified?
I believe it's due to the inspection. So
Okay.
before a permit is being closed, an inspector actually physically goes there and.
For every permit?
You could crowdsource that.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Hey, is the building there?
Right.
You just need to talk to every Chicago.
Exactly.
Just curious, I'm an architect, but we have to pull demo permits for buildings where we're going to demo out a number of walls, but we're not replacing the entire structure. So that bell curve makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of these buildings may need a little more TLC than others. When your demo permits we're knocking the building down to the ground.
That's what I went through hand by hand to make
I think what
sure.
you're describing appears as an alteration.
Not always.
Oh.
There can be I've found lots of demolition permits that were for parts of buildings. So I read every single work description, and if I wasn't sure that it was for a substantial real structure, not a garage, not a coach house,
So that's
but a
how you
real.
got down from 280,000 down to
That's
1,000.
right.
Did you find that histogram followed pretty accurately those highly densely tear down wards, like Ward 1 and did you say Ward 32 is number 1? I forget what you said.
You mean the building age?
Yeah, the building age.
I did not do it on a ward by ward basis. That would be really, really fascinating to do, especially because Chicago has an outer loop of its oldest stock.
Yeah.
And it'd be really, and it definitely falls into some of those wards, so that would be really interesting to do. There's lots of areas where you could take this, and I will get into that in just one second.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, no, because this is kind of the sad part. So I was able to give this presentation to, like I said, lots and lots and lots of stakeholders who had on-the-ground knowledge, and I would say if I could tell you one thing, is that when you're doing analysis like this, if you were ever to do analysis like this, you cannot show it to people who have on-the-ground knowledge of your data that you're working with enough, because every time you will get great observations that will help you shape whatever it is that you're doing. So the Urban Land Institute did choose to fund this study. Yay! Did a good job. They did it in Los Angeles. So if you're interested in the results of that, which were done by Preservation Green Lab, you can Google Partnership for Building Reuse. Their maps are nowhere near as good as mine. But, so I consulted on the LA project, which was great. And they do not have an open data portal. They spent $5,000 getting the permit data that they needed to do this study. And then just as I got the data and was about to map it, I got a job at IHS, and I never went back to this project again. Yes.
But I think LA just launched an open data. I don't know that it has this information.
Oh, okay. And since
There's one now.
Well, the job that I had as a consultant was to gather all the data that they would need to do the study, and literally 2 days before I called, they had made their city's GIS files free. Otherwise, those would have been like $58,000. So things are moving in LA. Any other questions?
Has there been a comparative study on? I saw the age of the buildings. 1890s was the highest in Chicago. What about other cities? Is there?
You mean just building age?
Well,
Yes.
if you think about it, we had the fire.
Right.
We did a lot of buildings, so
Right.
there is that curve to consider
Right.
in Chicago.
I can tell you from research that we've done at the Institute for Housing Studies that it's a big question mark. There's a good chunk of the city we don't know when it was built, because those records have been destroyed in lots of different instances. So we don't feel like there's, not that we know every single resource, but we don't feel like there's one definitive source where you can get the building ages of all the buildings in Chicago.
Do you think it'll go up? Like in coming decades? Do you think it'll go up that high, or?
What would go up that high?
The age of the buildings. Do you think it'll?
You mean, do I think the buildings will last? Like, I don't know.
More or less, right?
I don't know. I feel like Chicago's a very well-built city. The vast majority of our building stock here is old, so the chances are it will stay that way, just because it'd be difficult to tear all those buildings down and rebuild them.
Did you compare this to any other data sources? Like, I know when you're on Redfin or something like that, you can get a house's age on Redfin, and that's sort of crowdsourced in a little bit.
A little bit. We were just talking about, for instance, at IHS, one of our major sources of data is the county assessor's data, but the county assessor is assessing you for your taxes, right? And they're interested in when your building was last renovated in order to tax you. So building ages in that data set have to do with renovation, not with construction. So at the time, building outline shape file was the best source I could find that would take me, I just had to geocode it and then I was done. Looking up address by address was difficult, but I did compare my findings to some on the ground by taking that geocoded demolitions permit file, turning into a KML and looking at those addresses in Google Earth and kind of trying to see what was there before and what was there now. Again, with 8,000 demolition permits, I could only check, 50 or so by hand, but I found a good rate of the demolitions that actually occurred, but I had a lot of other people tell me that's not always the case.
Great one.
Oh, thank you. Well, thanks for listening.